Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here today. I have, what I'm going to talk about today is replacement rates for retirement. If you're outside the US, these are often referred to as replacement ratios. In a sense, my topic is a lot simpler than, I think, pretty much all the papers that have come today. On the other hand, I think it's a very interesting topic. It demands some kind of big conceptual sorts of decisions, and where you come down on these decisions really has big impact on where you think retirement security stands in the US today. Just to summarize, I mean, replacement rates are kind of a rule of thumb measure that individuals and policymakers use for measuring retirement income adequacy. They compare the retirement income, or for policy perspectives, often the Social Security benefit you receive, to your pre-retirement earnings. So you get some percentage that you get out of that. The one thing I want to emphasize here is that replacement rates are a rule of thumb. They need to be simple and understandable and usable both by ordinary people and by policymakers. I'll give you an example here. The Social Security Administration on their website says something like, if you're an average earner, you will receive a Social Security replacement rate of 40% of your pre-retirement earnings. Most financial advisors think you need a 70% replacement rate to replicate your pre-retirement standard of living. So that's a good example. I mean, as it happens, those numbers are calculated in a way that's inconsistent with each other, and both of them are probably wrong. But that's the sort of number and thinking that people and policymakers want. So if you think about these issues and you're tempted to say, well, what I want to do is, a full life cycle analysis with earnings uncertainty and out-of-pocket healthcare costs and all that, I'm like, that's great. But for policy purposes and for individual retirement planning purposes, things need to be kept very simple, and that really is, there's a premium on that. If you're thinking about retirement income adequacy in the US, how Americans are saving, this definition of replacement rates matters a ton. If you read, you'll see some studies out there that conclude there's a retirement crisis in the US, that majorities of Americans are undersaving substantially for retirement. On the other hand, you can find studies that say we have a much more smaller and more manageable problem. Something like Gail Schultz and Seshadri says, well, it's about 25% of Americans are undersaving, and contingent on undersaving, they're probably, 10% short of what they need. So you get these very different conclusions about where Americans stand in terms of their retirement saving, and those are driven in large part by the sorts of decisions that I'm going to talk about here. So it's, some of the stuff may not be clear cut, but where you fall on it has a big impact on the sorts of results you get. For a long time, replacement rates didn't get much discussion. It was just something we used these numbers a lot, but we didn't think very much about where they came from. I've been interested in this, for probably about 10 years when I was at Social Security, and I did some work on it back then. More recently, though, it's sort of come into the news to the degree anything we do is in the news. It's come to more prominence because in 2014, last year, the Social Security trustees pulled the replacement rate numbers from the Social Security trustees report. That 40% figure that I mentioned before, they pulled that because they thought the way these replacement rates were calculated could be misleading to people. There's a variety of different issues with replacement rates that we can think about. For reasons of time, I'm going to focus on, I think, two of the most important ones. The first is, what is the denominator of the replacement rate calculation? We know that the numerator is your retirement income or your Social Security benefit or whatever. The denominator, what do you divide it by? We know it's pre-retirement earnings. What do we mean by that? The second issue is, should we make an adjustment to replacement rates for what you call family composition, family size, particularly the number of children that you have? That's something that a lot of academic studies will do those sorts of adjustments. Most public consumption studies don't, and that helps lead to big differences in the conclusions that you draw. To think about first, I'll talk about how we think about defining the denominator of the replacement rate calculation. When people often think about replacement rates, often financial advisors will calculate the replacement rate relative to the individual's final earnings. Say if you retire at 65, they'll divide your Social Security benefit at 65 by your earnings at 64. there's actually kind of a consensus, amidst the disagreement, that that's probably not the way to go. If you're looking at say a public sector pension or a corporate pension where earnings are very steady, that's an okay way to do it. But if you're thinking about Social Security, if you're thinking about the broad population, final earnings are a very noisy sort of figure, and they may not be representative of the total earnings or income available to you over your lifetime. So there's a general consensus that we want to think about some career average earnings. The question is, how do you index those earnings? We don't want to use nominal earnings because that doesn't account for inflation. So there's two ways of thinking about it. The first is to index a person's past earnings for wages. What this means in kind of mathematically is we'll take your earnings in some given year, let's say 1980. It'll be multiplied by the ratio of the current average wage to the average economy-wide wage in 1980. So you're increasing that amount more than the rate of inflation, but to reflect the growth of wages in the economy. The underlying, the effect of this is that it gives you a higher pre-retirement earnings and a lower replacement rate. If you think about the factoid I gave you before about an average Social Security replacement rate of 40%, that's relative to your wage-indexed career average earnings. The underlying kind of philosophy that drives this is sort of a keeping up with the Joneses kind of relative income hypothesis approach. What it assumes is you derive utility not from your income itself, but from where your income lies relative to the income of others. So what they're assuming you're going to do is not smooth your consumption so much as smooth your income relative to the overall income distribution over time. So if the maximum you can get is, say, the 25th percentile of the income distribution, you want to maintain that. What that implies is that you want your consumption to rise along with wages in the economy. So you're not thinking of smoothing your own consumption from year to year. You're thinking of having it rise each year with the average economy-wide wage. The alternative that's been talked about is using inflation-indexed earnings. This is, you simply take the past earnings, you index them for the growth of prices. This reflects sort of the real purchasing power you had over your lifetime. You can think of this as kind of a simplified life cycle approach, where what you're looking to do is smooth the buying power you had available to you, both pre and post-retirement. The difference is when you use these different methods, they come to their important differences. Your wage-indexed average earnings of your career are usually 20 or 25% higher than your inflation-indexed average earnings. So that's going to have an impact on your replacement rates. The Congressional Budget Office put out a study a few months ago where they compared these two measures, and they looked for individuals born in the 1960s. The average individual will receive a Social Security replacement rate of about 46% of their wage-indexed average earnings, but 58% of their inflation-indexed average earnings. So the adequacy of those benefits really depends a lot in terms of what you're defining it against, of deciding how much people actually want to take. My general take on this is that if you're trying, again, if you're thinking of a simplified measure here, I think that using inflation-indexed earnings is both more understandable to individuals, but I think it's also more consistent with how people actually tend to think about their retirement planning. I'm not saying people don't think of how they stack up to the Joneses. They don't, people do buy luxury cars, so they'll look good relative to their neighbors. But in general, I don't think that relative income approach is really the best way to think about this issue. The second issue is thinking about family size and composition. And the core question here is, how does having children affect your need to save for retirement? The Department of Agriculture estimates, I don't know why it's the Department of Agriculture who estimates it, but they estimate that the cost of raising a child up through high school graduation today is somewhere around $250,000. Add whatever what is Wharton charging these days? Add whatever the college of your choice is charging on top of that. And so the question is, how does that affect, if you're a household with kids versus without having kids, how does that affect your need to save for retirement? So you can think of this question as, do parents save to maintain their own pre-retirement standard of living, the amount they as individuals consumed, Or do they save to maintain the household's pre-retirement standard of living, including the amount that the household devoted to the lifestyle of the kids before retirement? This has, a very big effect on the outcomes. The Gale-Schultz-Shishadri study, which finds most Americans are pretty well prepared for retirement, that uses a family size adjustment. The National Retirement Risk Index from up at Boston College, which doesn't, finds a much bigger problem. In the National Retirement Risk Index, just to give you an illustration, they find, I think it may be 53%, but it's around 55% of Americans they find are at risk of an insufficient income retirement. If they do a family size adjustment, they say it falls to, I think, around 18 or 19%. So it's a really, really big effect. In the numbers I'm going to present later, I use the sort of adult equivalence formula from Citro and Michael from National Academy of Science study from 1995, which at that time was used for calculating the poverty rate. I think the alternative poverty rate that is out now uses a similar kind of formula. And if in any given year, we take the household's entire earnings and you divide it by the number of adult equivalents, which is a factor of the number of adults, which is A, number of children, K, and P and F are factors which P reflects how much does a child consume relative to an adult, and F reflects the economies of scale of larger household sizes. The conventional figures to use for that are about 0.7. That's the numbers I used here. One way of, this is sort of an evolving debate, and things continue. One way I like to think about this, though, there's one study from Cohen-Webb that uses the HRS. That concludes that when parents or when kids move out of a household, the parents tend to increase their consumption to match what the whole household consumed when the kids were there. This would indicate not to use a household size adjustment. That study had a sample size of about 35 households, so there's some issues there. There's a German study from Rotke, and I'm having a mental block now, which had a much better data set. That tended to find that when children left the household, the parents gradually, or the household consumption gradually adjusted down after a period of about 4 years. For parents who were likely to have kids in college, the adjustment was a little bit slower. That would point toward using a household adjustment. But here's the intuition that I think about with this. There is evidence from an earlier paper from Schultz and Shishadri that households with children have lower wealth than households without them. I think it's around 10% for each child you have, holding other things equal. What that would tell me is, there's one of two conclusions that can come from that. One is that parents are saving to replicate their own pre-retirement consumption, not the consumption of the household, including the kids. Or the alternate conclusion is having kids is bad for your retirement security. Which is, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that's how I see it. One way of testing it, in the HRS, they ask, this comes from a paper from a couple of years ago from Suzanne Rowetter out at Rand, and they ask individuals, subjective questions about retirement security. How do you worry a lot about income in retirement? How does your income in retirement compare to your income before retirement? Those sorts of questions. And what she found from the data there is there's no difference between how parents judge their retirement income adequacy versus non-parents, holding other things constant. What that tells me is probably the story where parents are trying to save to replicate their own standard of living is the better way of thinking about it. So in the numbers I'm going to present, I'm going to include that kind of adjustment. Now, to illustrate this, I used a microsimulation model put together by the Policy Simulation Group. And the idea here is to try to catch, catch the distribution of earnings and Social Security benefits. It couples people to households so you can catch the way that the Social Security benefit formula interacts between household earnings. The two things it projects are Social Security benefits and employer-sponsored pensions. There are other models that include things like other asset income, implicit housing, or implicit rent, things like that. Here, all we're looking at is Social Security employer-sponsored pensions. I looked at it for the 1940 birth cohort, and I measured replacement rates as of age 70. The idea there is you want to catch it by the point at which almost everybody has claimed Social Security benefits. And here, this kind of illustrates some of the differences. If I take, in all these cases, I'm looking at household replacement rates. But if you take wage-indexed earnings without a family size adjustment, the median replacement rate for Social Security benefits was 54% of average wage-indexed earnings. If you convert that to CPI-indexed earnings, the median replacement rate from Social Security benefits goes up to 65%. And then if you do CPI-indexed earnings, I'm sorry, my third line should have said with family size adjustment, then your replacement rate goes up to 82%. So this is your median, and you can think for yourself of what counts as adequate. But what this would tell you is the Social Security benefits are roughly, for the median retiree, equivalent to about 82% of their real pre-retirement earnings. If you look at this, if you take out, here I'm looking at Social Security plus pension benefits, CPI indexed relative to inflation indexed earnings without the family, or another typo, with the family size adjustment goes to the median replacement rate is 126%. 75% of households have replacement rates greater than 85%, 90% of replacement rates greater than 50%. One thing I would say is I'm pretty confident the estimates here are as accurate as these sort of projections are, in the sense of there's a variety of different models. I'm thinking here about the Social Security Administration's MINT model, which is another microsimulation that I worked on when I was at SSA. If you use the same definitions of replacement rates that I'm using, you're going to get very similar results. So the projections may be right or wrong, but what's driving these results is not that the projections are that much more optimistic than others. It's really coming down to these sorts of definitions that we're thinking about. So just to kind of wrap things up, I mean, it's how you define adequacy matters. There's the two questions of how much people will have in retirement and how much people need in retirement. There's been an enormous amount of time and taxpayer money expended on trying to project how much income people will have in retirement. You have government, I mean, SSA has a model to do that, CBO has a model to do that, a variety of outside think tanks have models to do it. There's been a lot less thought given to how much people need in retirement, and the decisions you make on that are very, very important. Just to pull numbers out of my head, I mean, if you look at the Social Security Administration's microsim model, which is similar to what I used here, their projections for both sort of the median and the distribution of replacement rates relative to inflation-adjusted pre-retirement earnings are pretty steady going out. You're not seeing an enormous decline in replacement rates. That, I think, is a very, very important thing to know. The composition of retirement income is changing significantly, much less in DB pensions, much more coming from DC plans, but the actual sort of replacement rates, the retirement income relative to what you had before retirement is not changing all that much. So I think this is something which I think policymakers really need to engage on a lot. Your typical member of Congress thinking about retirement income, his knowledge goes as far as Social Security will pay you 40%, you need 70%. That's as good as it gets. And so we need a lot more thinking about really what kinds of income people want in Social Security, or from Social Security retirement, what we're going to be able to provide for them, and also think very carefully about how we express that to people in ways that are understandable to them. Thanks very much.